Arthur Whitfield had rewritten his will years ago. At 76, he believed that chapter of his life was settled. His three children knew he had planned carefully. His lawyer had the signed original secured away, and Arthur had never once considered changing it. That certainty ended the moment his lawyer quietly placed another will on the desk. "I need you to look at this," he said. Arthur adjusted his glasses and glanced at the first page. His name was there. His signature was there. The date was only a few weeks old. His stomach tightened. "I've never seen this before." The lawyer nodded. "I know." Arthur turned each page more slowly than the last. The language looked familiar, yet the distribution of his estate was different. The family home, the small construction business he had spent 40 years building, and the lake property no longer reflected the decisions he had made. Someone had created a second version of his final wishes, and they had done it while he was still alive. Arthur looked up, expecting an explanation that would make the impossible disappear. "There has to be some mistake." His lawyer shook his head. "We've already confirmed your original will is still valid." "Then how did this get here?" The room fell quiet. The lawyer folded his hands before answering. "I can't explain how it arrived." Arthur had spent most of his life solving problems. As a contractor, he learned to look for the weak point before deciding how to fix it. Every crack had a cause. Every mistake left a trail. But this wasn't a damaged foundation. It was his family. He searched the pages again, hoping to find something obvious that would prove the document was nonsense. Instead, it looked convincing enough to unsettle him. Not because he feared losing his estate, because someone had tried to rewrite his intentions without his knowledge. For the first time in years, Arthur thought about Eleanor. His late wife had always believed that honesty held a family together. If something matters, she used to tell him, "Say it before silence says it for you." He wished she were sitting beside him now. Instead, he was alone with a document that shouldn't exist. Arthur slid the pages back across the desk. "What happens now?" His lawyer didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "We keep this between us?" Arthur frowned. "You think whoever did this doesn't know I've seen it?" "I hope not." The lawyer met Arthur's eyes. "Because if they believe the forgery went unnoticed, they may make another mistake." Arthur stared at the document one last time. He had walked into the office believing his greatest concern was growing older. He walked out carrying a far more unsettling question. If someone had rewritten his final wishes, who had been close enough to know exactly what they were? As Arthur reached the door, his lawyer quietly added 3 words that changed everything. "Someone close forged this." Arthur drove home with the lawyer's final words echoing in his mind. "Someone close forged this." The drive felt shorter than usual. When he unlocked the front door, the familiar scent of old wood and fresh coffee greeted him. He had built this modest house with his own hands decades earlier. Every room carried a memory of Eleanor, of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary evenings that had once seemed endless. Now, the house felt strangely unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed, because Arthur had. Over the next few days, he tried to settle back into his routine. He mowed the lawn, sorted through old paperwork, and spent quiet mornings on the porch. Outwardly, nothing was different. Privately, he couldn't stop wondering how someone had known enough about his estate to create such a convincing document. His estate wasn't extravagant, but it represented a lifetime of work. There was the family home he had built from the ground up, the small residential construction business he had spent more than 40 years growing before retirement, and the lake property where the family had gathered every summer while Eleanor was alive. Each piece carried memories far more valuable than money. By the end of the week, Arthur invited his 3 children to Sunday dinner, just as he had done countless times before. Daniel arrived first. At 49, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone determined to appear in control, even when life wasn't cooperating. Melissa came next, greeting her father with a warm hug before asking if he needed help in the kitchen, as she always did. Ryan arrived last. He apologized for running a few minutes late and quietly took his place at the table. The evening unfolded much like every family dinner before it. Stories were shared. Old memories resurfaced. Everyone laughed at one of Arthur's familiar tales from his construction days. Looking around the table, it was almost impossible to believe that one of these three people might have betrayed his trust. Arthur hated the thought. He found himself watching less for guilt than for understanding. Each of his children seemed completely at ease. If someone was hiding the truth, they showed no sign of it. As dinner came to an end, Arthur cleared the plates while his children continued talking in the living room. For a brief moment, the house sounded exactly as it had years ago. It reminded him what was truly at stake. Not the house, not the business, not the lake property. His family? And that was exactly why he knew he couldn't ask the question burning in his mind. Not yet. For the next several days, Arthur said nothing. The forged will remained locked inside his lawyer's office, known only to the two of them. Every instinct told Arthur to gather his children, place the document on the table, and demand an explanation. But instinct wasn't enough. If he accused the wrong person, the damage could outlast any answer he found. So he made a decision. He would investigate quietly. His lawyer supported the plan. Together, they would verify every detail, review the document carefully, and follow the evidence wherever it led without alerting in the family. Arthur understood what that meant. He would have to keep living as though nothing had happened. A week after his visit to the lawyer, he invited Daniel, Melissa, and Ryan over for another Sunday dinner. The invitation wasn't unusual. The reason behind it was, as he prepared the meal, Arthur reminded himself that this wasn't a test designed to catch someone making a mistake. It was simply the first chance to observe his family with new eyes. When the three of them arrived, the evening unfolded naturally. Daniel talked about work without offering many details. Melissa laughed as she teased her brothers about an old fishing trip at the lake. Ryan listened more than he spoke, smiling politely whenever the conversation turned his way. Nothing felt forced. Nothing looked suspicious. That was almost unsettling. Arthur realized how easily doubt could change ordinary moments. A pause in conversation, a glance across the table, someone checking a phone. Before the forged will, those things would have meant nothing. Now they invited questions he couldn't answer. He spoke less than usual, listening carefully as the conversation drifted from family news to plans for the coming summer. His children noticed he was quieter, but none of them seemed concerned. To them, it was another peaceful Sunday. To Arthur, it was the beginning of an investigation he never imagined conducting inside his own home. As the evening came to an end, his children hugged him goodbye and drove away. Arthur remained standing on the porch until their cars disappeared down the street. The house fell silent again. He realized the hardest part of this journey wouldn't be uncovering the truth. It would be pretending that every family gathering still felt the same. If you're enjoying the story so far, consider subscribing and let us know in the comments. Who would you trust first if you found yourself in Arthur's position? Arthur had a feeling the answer wouldn't come from suspicion alone. It would come from the one detail everyone else had overlooked. The days that followed settled into an uneasy routine. Arthur kept his promise to his lawyer. He asked no questions. He made no accusations. Instead, he paid closer attention to the lives unfolding around him. What troubled him most was Daniel. His oldest son had become noticeably more private. During visits, he stepped outside to answer phone calls and quickly changed the subject whenever business came up. Arthur also learned that Daniel had recently met with another lawyer. None of those things proved anything. But together they formed the strongest lead Arthur had. Arthur resisted the urge to jump to conclusions. The forged will was real. His suspicions were not. A few days later, Arthur drove past Daniel's office on an errand across town. He noticed Daniel standing outside the building with a folder tucked under his arm. After a brief conversation with someone Arthur didn't recognize, Daniel disappeared inside. Arthur kept driving. Watching from a distance answered nothing. It only confirmed that Daniel was carrying a burden he hadn't shared with his family. Later that week, Arthur met privately with his lawyer to compare everything they had gathered. They reviewed the timeline surrounding the forged will, Daniel's recent legal meetings, and the details already confirmed. As Arthur studied the document once more, something caught his attention. A small inconsistency. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle detail that didn't align with the sequence of Arthur's legitimate estate records. His lawyer paused and examined it again. It may not seem like much, he said, but details like this matter. The inconsistency didn't identify the person responsible. It didn't clear anyone either. What it did was challenge the direction of the investigation. For the first time, Arthur wondered whether the strongest suspicion was also the easiest one to believe. He left the office with more uncertainty than answers. The investigation hadn't moved closer to a name, but it had taken its first unexpected turn. And Arthur knew that from this point forward, every assumption would have to earn its place through evidence, not instinct. The inconsistency in the forged will force Arthur to slow down. Until now, every loose thread seemed to lead back to Daniel. Now he wasn't so sure. Still, one question refused to disappear. Why had Daniel been meeting with another lawyer? Rather than speculate, Arthur decided to give his son opportunity to explain without revealing the investigation. A few days later, he invited Daniel to lunch at a small diner they had visited for years. The conversation began easily, drifting from old construction projects to Daniel's children. But Arthur noticed the familiar strain behind his son's smile. Finally, he asked, "How's the business?" Daniel hesitated before answering. It could be better. It was the first honest response Arthur had heard in weeks. Daniel admitted that business had slowed, bills had piled up, and he had recently met with a lawyer to discuss options for securing a business loan. He hadn't told the family because he was embarrassed. "I kept thinking I could fix it before anyone noticed," he said quietly. Arthur understood that feeling all too well. They finished lunch talking less about money and more about life. When they parted, Arthur felt relief, but also shame. He had spent weeks quietly suspecting, a son who had simply been protecting his pride. That afternoon, Arthur shared everything Daniel had told him with his lawyer. The explanation fit every question surrounding the legal meetings. Daniel's secrecy suddenly had a completely different meaning. His lawyer listened carefully before closing the file. "Then we need to stop building a case around assumptions," he said. "The document has to speak for itself." He recommended bringing in an independent, forensic document examiner, someone who could evaluate the question paperwork without relying on family dynamics or personal opinions. Arthur agreed immediately. If the truth was still hidden, evidence, not suspicion, would have to uncover it. The arrangements were made quietly. No one in the family would know the document was being examined. As Arthur left the office, he realized the investigation had changed. It was no longer about finding the child who looked the most suspicious. It was about following the facts wherever they led. And for the first time since the forged will appeared, those facts were beginning to point somewhere Arthur had never expected. The forensic review began quietly. Arthur never met the examiner. Everything went through his lawyer, keeping the investigation as private as possible. Days turned into a week. Life outside the investigation continued as usual. Arthur kept his routines, answered phone calls from his children, and accepted their visits without giving away what weighed on his mind. The waiting wasn't pleasant, but there was nothing more he could do. One afternoon, Melissa stopped by with groceries. She noticed he seemed distracted. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said as she unpacked the bags. Arthur smiled faintly. "Just getting older, I suppose." Melissa didn't look convinced, but she didn't press him. Before leaving, she reminded him that he didn't have to carry every burden alone. Her words stayed with him long after she drove away. A few days later, Arthur's phone rang. It was his lawyer. "The report is back." Within the hour, Arthur was sitting across the same desk where the impossible story had begun. His lawyer opened the examiner's report. The review found no evidence connecting Daniel to the questioned document. Arthur let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The report had also identified characteristics that ruled out the assumptions surrounding Daniel's involvement. His recent legal meetings and financial difficulties had no connection to the forged will. The strongest suspect was no longer a suspect at all. Relief came first, then guilt. Arthur thought about the quiet lunch they had shared only days earlier. Daniel had trusted him enough to admit his struggles, never knowing his father had silently questioned his character. Arthur wished he could apologize. But an apology would require explaining why one was needed, and the investigation wasn't over. His lawyer carefully closed the report. "We've eliminated one possibility," he said. "But someone still created that document." Arthur nodded. The list of answers had grown shorter. So had the list of people he could trust without question. As he left the office, the afternoon felt strangely heavier than before. Clearing Daniel should have brought peace. Instead, it left Arthur facing a more difficult truth. The forgery hadn't disappeared. It simply belonged to someone else. And for the first time, his thoughts drifted toward the one person he had spent the least time questioning. Daniel had been cleared. That should have brought Arthur comfort. Instead, it left him with a quieter, heavier question. If his oldest son wasn't responsible, then someone else in the family had carried this secret without leaving an obvious trail. Arthur refused to let suspicion settle on anyone without reason. The investigation had already taught him how easily appearances could mislead. Over the next week, he returned to ordinary routines. He visited the hardware store, spent mornings tending the yard, and answered the occasional phone call from his children. Outwardly, life looked unchanged. Privately, he and his lawyer continued reviewing every piece of information connected to the forged will. Then another lead surfaced. During a routine search of records connected to the investigation, Arthur's lawyer uncovered evidence of an earlier draft related to the forged document. It had never been finalized, but it had existed before the version Arthur first saw. The draft had one important connection. It had been traced to Ryan's apartment. Arthur stared at the folder without speaking. Ryan? The thought felt almost impossible. His youngest son had always avoided conflict. He rarely asked for anything and often seemed content to let others take the lead. Arthur searched his memory for anything that fit this new direction. Nothing did. Later that afternoon, he drove to Ryan's apartment under the simple excuse of checking in on him. Ryan welcomed him inside with genuine surprise. The apartment was modest but tidy. They talked over coffee about everyday things, work, the weather, an old fishing rod Ryan still hadn't repaired. Everything felt ordinary. As Arthur prepared to leave, his eyes drifted across a bookshelf in the living room. A framed family photograph rested between a row of books. Daniel stood beside Eleanor, smiling proudly. Melissa leaned against Arthur's shoulder. Ryan was there too, but only at the edge of the picture, partly hidden behind everyone else. Arthur couldn't remember ever noticing that before. Ryan followed his father's gaze. "Mom always liked that picture," he said with a small smile. Arthur nodded, but the image stayed with him long after he left. It wasn't evidence. It didn't prove anything. Yet for the first time, he wondered whether the investigation had focused so much on actions that it had overlooked something quieter. Not greed, not opportunity, but years of feelings that had never been spoken aloud. As he drove home, Arthur realized the path to the truth might not begin with what someone had done. It might begin with what someone had silently carried for far too long. The photograph stayed in Arthur's mind for days, not because it proved anything, because it reminded him how easily small moments could be forgotten while still leaving lasting impressions. He resisted drawing conclusions. A family picture couldn't explain a forged will. It could only remind him that every family carried memories differently. A few days later, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly with a box of pastries from Arthur's favorite bakery. "I figured we hadn't caught up in a while," he said. They spent the afternoon talking across the kitchen table. Daniel spoke openly about the challenges facing his business. He admitted that keeping those worries to himself had only made things harder. Arthur listened more carefully than he had in weeks. His son had trusted him with the truth, never knowing he had once been the center of Arthur's quiet suspicions. The weight of that realization settled heavily on him. For a brief moment, Arthur almost revealed everything. The forged will, the investigation, the mistake he had nearly made. But he stopped himself until every answer was clear. Sharing only part of the truth would help no one. After Daniel left, Arthur met privately with his lawyer. The investigation had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. His lawyer placed another folder on the desk. "We found something connected to the earlier draft," he said. Arthur opened it carefully. The records didn't reveal who had forged the will, but they confirmed that the draft had been connected to Ryan's apartment before the final document ever surfaced. Arthur closed the folder without speaking. This wasn't proof. It was simply the first piece of evidence that redirected the investigation away from Daniel. For weeks, Arthur had been searching in one direction. Now the path led somewhere he had never expected. As he left the office, one question stayed with him. If the evidence continued pointing toward Ryan, would he be ready to face whatever came next? Arthur barely slept that night. The folder from his lawyer remained on the dining room table, unopened since he had returned home. He already knew what it contained. Reading it again wouldn't change where the evidence was leading. For the first time since the investigation began, Arthur wasn't afraid of discovering the truth. He was afraid the truth might involve Ryan. The thought followed him through the week. He found himself reaching for the phone more than once, tempted to call his youngest son simply to hear his voice. Each time, he stopped. If he let emotion guide him now, he could jeopardize everything. A few days later, Arthur experienced a brief spell of dizziness while working in the yard. It passed within minutes, but it was enough to remind him that time was no longer something he could take for granted. That evening, he sat alone on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees. For years, he had believed a carefully written will was the best way to protect his family after he was gone. Now he realized a document couldn't repair what had never been spoken aloud. The investigation had become about more than uncovering a forgery. It was about understanding the fracture that had made it possible. The next morning, Arthur met with his lawyer once again. They reviewed every piece of evidence collected over the past several weeks. Nothing contradicted the new direction. Each detail, small on its own, pointed toward the same conclusion. His lawyer finally closed the file. "I think we're close," he said quietly. Arthur nodded. "So do I." Driving home, he passed the lake property where his family had spent so many summers together. He remembered children laughing from the dock, Eleanor calling everyone in for a dinner, and evenings that had seemed ordinary at the time. Looking back, they felt priceless. Arthur understood then that finding the truth wasn't enough. However this ended, he wanted his family to have something better than unanswered questions and quiet resentment. He wanted them to have honesty. As he turned into his driveway, Arthur made a decision. He would finish the investigation. And once he knew the whole truth, he would face it without anger, without secrecy, and without running from the conversation that had waited far too long. If this story has kept you thinking, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if the hardest truth you ever had to face involved someone you loved? Arthur would soon have to answer that question himself. The answer Arthur had been searching for arrived without drama. There was no shocking confession, no hidden witness, just the quiet weight of evidence that piece by piece left only one name. Ryan. Arthur sat across from his lawyer as they reviewed the investigation one final time. Daniel had been eliminated. Melissa had never been a realistic suspect. The recovered draft connected to Ryan's apartment, combined with the timeline and supporting records, formed a picture that could no longer be ignored. Arthur closed the file. For several moments, neither man spoke. "I wish it had led somewhere else," Arthur finally said. "So do I," his lawyer replied. Driving home, Arthur felt less like he had solved a mystery and more like he had uncovered a wound that had existed for years without anyone seeing it. He didn't think about the forged will first. He thought about Ryan, the youngest of three, the quiet one, the son who rarely asked for help. Arthur replayed old family gatherings in his mind. Daniel often carried the expectations that came with being the oldest. Melissa naturally stepped in whenever someone needed support. Ryan had never demanded attention. Arthur had mistaken that silence for contentment. Now he wondered how many opportunities he had missed to simply ask if his youngest son was truly doing all right. The evidence pointed toward Ryan, but it also pointed toward something deeper than money. If this had been about greed alone, the pieces would never fit together the way they did. This felt rooted in fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear of believing he no longer had a place in the family he loved. That realization hurt more than the forgery itself. Arthur knew what the law allowed. He could pursue the matter through the courts if he chose. But that wasn't the first question on his mind. The first question was far more personal. Why? Not to excuse what had happened. To understand it? Because once anger spoke first, understanding rarely had a chance. As evening settled over the Whitfield home, Arthur picked up his phone. He looked at Ryan's name for a long moment before pressing the call button. When Ryan answered, his voice sounded relaxed. "Hi, Dad." Arthur kept his own voice calm. "Would you come by tomorrow?" A brief pause. "Sure. Is everything okay?" Arthur looked out the window toward the yard he had spent decades caring for. "We need to talk." Ryan agreed without asking another question. Arthur ended the call and quietly set the phone down. After weeks of searching, the investigation was over. The conversation that truly mattered was about to begin. Arthur barely slept that night. For weeks he had searched for answers. Now that he had them, they felt heavier than the questions. He walked slowly through the house before sunrise, pausing at the framed photographs that lined the hallway. There was one from the wake, another from Christmas years earlier. One showed all 5 of them standing in front of the home he had built with his own hands. They looked like the family he had always believed they were. Arthur wondered how many quiet struggles had existed behind those smiles. He thought about Eleanor. She had always noticed what others missed. If one of the children seemed withdrawn, she was the first to ask why. Arthur had often focused on solving practical problems instead. Looking back, he realized there were moments when Ryan had quietly stepped aside while everyone else's lives demanded attention. Arthur had never intended to make his youngest son feel invisible. But intentions didn't erase the feeling. Late that morning, Melissa stopped by after work. She immediately sensed something was different. "You'd been carrying something for weeks," she said gently. "You don't have to tell me what it is. But whatever it is, don't carry it forever." Arthur looked at his daughter for a long moment. He wanted to tell her everything. Instead, he simply nodded. "I know." Melissa smiled sadly. "Mom used to say that families don't fall apart because they argue. They fall apart because they stop talking." After she left, Arthur remained at the kitchen table, repeating those words to himself. For the first time since the forged will appeared, he understood exactly what he needed to do. Not call the police. Not begin a legal fight. The law could determine what had happened. It couldn't heal why it had happened. That responsibility belonged to him. He picked up the phone and looked once more at Ryan's number. There was no anger left, only determination. If his son had crossed a line, Arthur needed to hear the reason from Ryan himself. Not through reports. Not through documents. Face to face. He pressed the call button. Ryan answered almost immediately. "Hi, Dad." Arthur spoke with the same calm voice he had used throughout the investigation. "Could you come by this afternoon?" "Of course. I'd appreciate it." When the call ended, Arthur set the phone down and took one slow breath. For weeks, he had lived as an investigator. Now he would simply be a father. And before the day was over, both of them would have to face a truth that neither could change. Ryan arrived that afternoon right on time. He smiled as Arthur opened the door, but the expression faded almost immediately. His father looked different. Not angry. Just unusually quiet. They settled at the kitchen table, where so many family conversations had taken place over the years. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Arthur finally broke the silence. "I have been working through something these past several weeks." Ryan listened without interrupting. "It started when my lawyer called me to his office." Arthur watched his son's face carefully. "He showed me another version of my will." Ryan's eyes dropped to the table. "A version I never wrote." The room became painfully still. Arthur didn't raise his voice. "You didn't accuse?" He simply continued. "I didn't tell anyone." I wanted to understand what had happened before I spoke. Ryan's hands tightened around the coffee mug in front of him. Arthur reached into a folder beside his chair and placed a few papers on the table, not as evidence to corner his son, only to show that the search for answers had reached its end. I know the draft was traced back to your apartment. Ryan stared at the papers without touching them. Arthur waited. The silence stretched between them until Ryan finally spoke. I kept hoping, somehow, you'd never find out. His voice was barely above a whisper. Arthur closed the folder. I didn't ask you here to shame you. Ryan's shoulders began to tremble. I just need you to tell me why. For a long moment, Ryan couldn't answer. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears he had been holding back for years. I was scared. Arthur said nothing. I know how that sounds, Ryan continued. It wasn't just about the will. His voice cracked. I kept telling myself everyone else had their place. He swallowed hard. Daniel always seemed successful. Melissa was the one everyone leaned on. He looked down again, and I convinced myself that one day there wouldn't be a place left for me. Arthur felt the weight of those words settle over the room. He had spent weeks searching for the person responsible. Now he was listening to the pain that had led his son there. Ryan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I know what I did was wrong. Arthur nodded slowly. Yes. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Not filled with suspicion, but with two men standing on the edge of the hardest conversation they had ever shared. And for the first time since the forged will appeared, the truth was no longer hiding behind a document. It was sitting across the table. Ryan sat with his head lowered, unable to meet his father's eyes. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with years neither of them had ever spoken about. I never wanted to steal from you, Ryan said quietly. I never even knew what was in your real will. Arthur listened without interrupting. I just kept convincing myself that one day I'd be the one left out. His voice trembled. Every time life went wrong, it felt easier to believe I'd already disappointed everyone. He took a slow breath before continuing. Forging that will didn't fix anything. It only gave me something else to be ashamed of. Arthur looked at his son for a long moment. I asked myself one question every day since this began, he said. How could someone in this family do something like this? Ryan closed his eyes. But I should have been asking another question. Ryan looked up. What made you believe you were alone? Tears rolled down Ryan's face. I don't know exactly when it started. He shook his head. It just became easier to stay quiet than admit I needed help. Arthur felt his own voice soften. I loved all three of you. I know, but love isn't always enough if someone doesn't feel it. The words lingered in the room. Arthur couldn't argue with them. He thought back over birthdays, family gatherings, and ordinary moments that had seemed complete at the time. Only now did he recognize how easy it had been to mistake Ryan's for peace. I'm responsible for my choice, Ryan said. No one made me forge that will. Arthur nodded, and I'm responsible for the times I failed to notice what you were carrying. Neither excuse erased the other. Both could be true. Ryan wiped away his tears. I'll accept whatever happens. Arthur looked across the table at his youngest son. There will be consequences, he said gently. Trust isn't rebuilt with words alone. Ryan nodded. I understand, but I don't want this family's future to be decided by another secret. Arthur stood and gathered the papers from the table. It's time everyone knows the truth. Ryan lowered his head once more. I'll tell them. Arthur rested a hand on his son's shoulder. We'll tell them. For the first time since the forged will surfaced, Ryan didn't have to carry the truth by himself. The conversation ahead would be painful. It would reopen wounds that had remained hidden for years. But Arthur knew something now that he hadn't understood at the beginning of this journey. Silence hadn't protected his family. Only honesty had a chance to. 2 evenings later, Arthur asked all 3 of his children to come to the family home. No one knew why. Daniel assumed it had something to do with Arthur's health. Melissa sensed the weight in her father's voice, but asked no questions. Ryan arrived last. He looked tired, quiet. When everyone had taken their seats around the dining table, Arthur remained standing. He looked at each of his children before speaking. I have kept something from all of you. The room fell silent. A few weeks ago, my lawyer showed me a forged version of my will. Daniel stared in disbelief. Melissa slowly covered her mouth. Ryan lowered his eyes. Arthur calmly explained everything. How the document had appeared while he was still alive. Why he had chosen to investigate privately. How the evidence had first pointed toward Daniel. Daniel looked at his father, confused. You thought it was me? For a time, Arthur admitted. And I was wrong. Daniel didn't speak. The hurt on his face was quiet but unmistakable. I'm sorry, Arthur said. You never knew what I was carrying, but you still deserved better from me. Daniel gave a slow nod. I wish you trusted me enough to tell me. So do I. Arthur turned toward Ryan. The investigation eventually led somewhere else. Ryan took a deep breath and stood. You don't have to explain it, Arthur said softly. I do, Ryan replied. His voice shook as he looked at his brother and sister. I forged the will. No one interrupted. Ryan told them everything? Not to defend himself, not to lessen what he had done, only to tell the truth. He spoke about years of believing he was falling behind, of convincing himself there would eventually be no place left for him in the family. When he finished, the room remained silent. Melissa walked across the room first. She wrapped her arms around her younger brother. I wish you had told us, she whispered. So do I. Daniel stood a moment later. His disappointment was clear. So is this, he said. What you did hurt all of us? Ryan nodded. I know, but you're still my brother. Arthur watched his children standing together. Not because everything had been repaired. Because nothing was hidden anymore. He placed his original will on the table. I'm writing a new one. His children looked at him in surprise. Not because my wishes have changed, Arthur said. Because from this day forward, there will be no more secrets about this family or what I leave behind. For the first time since the impossible document had appeared in his lawyer's office, Arthur felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The greatest inheritance he could leave his children was no longer written on those pages. It was the honesty now shared around the table. The following Saturday, Arthur returned to his lawyer's office. This time, he wasn't alone. Daniel, Melissa, and Ryan walked in beside him. A week earlier, that would have seemed impossible. Now, it felt necessary. The lawyer greeted each of them before placing Arthur's original will on the conference table. No one is here to negotiate, Arthur said, looking at his children. You're here because I never want another question about my wishes to be answered in secret. No one argued. For the first time in years, every conversation about the family's future happened with everyone present. Arthur carefully explained what mattered most to him. The family home wasn't simply a piece of property. It was where their lives had unfolded. The construction business represented decades of work, sacrifice, and pride. The lake property held memories of Eleanor and Summers that none of them wanted to forget. His children listened without interruption. There were questions. There were moments of disagreement, but every concern was spoken openly instead of quietly carried away. When the discussion ended, Arthur signed a newly prepared will that reflected the same intentions he had always held. Only now. Nothing about it was hidden from the people it affected. As the papers were gathered, Arthur looked at Ryan. This doesn't erase what happened. Ryan nodded. I know. Trust isn't rebuilt in a single afternoon. It isn't. Ryan accepted that there would be consequences measured not in punishment, but in consistency. He would have to earn back the confidence he had broken, one choice at a time. Arthur respected that answer. Outside the lawyer's office, the four of them stood together for a moment before walking to the parking lot. No one seemed eager to leave. Melissa smiled gently. I think Mom would be happy we finally talked instead of pretending everything was fine. Arthur smiled. I've been thinking the same thing. Daniel looked at Ryan. We've all got work to do. Ryan gave a small, grateful nod. I'll do mine. Driving home, Arthur realized the investigation had ended long before the paperwork was finished. The real victory hadn't been identifying the forged will. It had been replacing fear with honesty. His estate was finally settled. More importantly, so was the silence that had lived inside his family for far too many years. Several months passed. Life didn't return to the way it had been. Arthur was grateful for that. The old version of normal had depended on silence. The new one depended on conversations that were sometimes uncomfortable but always honest. One Sunday afternoon, the Whitfield family gathered again at the lake property. The dock had been repaired. The grill was smoking. Laughter drifted across the yard, much like it had years before. This time, though, Arthur noticed something different. No one was pretending. Daniel spoke openly about the slow recovery of his business. He no longer felt the need to carry every setback by himself. Melissa remained the steady presence she had always been, gently keeping everyone connected without trying to solve every problem. Ryan had changed in quieter ways. He hadn't asked anyone to forget what he had done. He simply showed up. He called his father regularly, helped with repairs around the house, and kept the promises he made. Trust wasn't restored overnight. It returned one ordinary day at a time. Arthur watched his children talking near the water and found himself thinking about Eleanor. She had once told him that a family wasn't measured by the mistakes it avoided. It was measured by what it chose to do after those mistakes came into the light. He finally understood what she meant. As the afternoon faded into evening, Melissa gathered everyone for a new family photograph. Arthur stood in the middle while his children moved into place beside him. This time, no one stood at the edge. Ryan stepped forward naturally, shoulder to shoulder with his brother and sister. The camera clicked. Arthur smiled, not because life had become perfect, but because it had become honest. He realized that a will could decide where a home, a business, or a piece of land would go. It could never decide whether a family stayed together. Only the people in it could do that. Looking at his children, Arthur knew the greatest inheritance he would ever leave behind wasn't written on legal paper. It was the courage to tell the truth before silence had the chance to rewrite it. If this story meant something to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about family, trust, and second chances, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Some inherit money. Some inherit property. The Whitfields learned that the most valuable inheritance of all is trust. And once it's broken, rebuilding it takes honesty, patience, and the quiet choice to keep showing up for one another. The forged will became part of the family's history. It never became the thing that defined their future.